Hello, everybody. I'm Kim T. Ha. It looks like we have a full room. I'm here from the Pennington Public Library, and I'd like to thank you for joining us in celebrating the centennial of the 19th Amendment's ratification with author Nancy Kennedy. We at the library are co-sponsoring this evening's event with the Hopewell Valley Historical Society and the Hopewell Museum. And before I introduce Nancy, I would like to first turn my mic over to Bob Warsnack, who will speak on behalf of both the Historical Society and the museum. So, hello, Bob. How are you doing this evening?
Hi, Kim. Thank you. I'm doing fine, thanks. And thanks for introducing me. I'd just like to tell everybody that I'm a volunteer as the program chairperson for the Hopewell Valley Historical Society and the Hopewell Museum. And I want to welcome Nancy Kennedy tonight and thank her for celebrating the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment with us tonight. I'm looking forward to hearing her talk about her book. I also want to thank Kim Ha for working with us over the past several months and helping us to continue to get our programming out to the public. I'd like to let everyone know that on September 20th, the Hopewell Valley Historical Society is planning to hold our annual meeting. Our current plans are to hold it on the grounds of the Jeremiah Woolsey home on Pennington, Washington Crossing Road, as well as to broadcast it live via Zoom. The program will feature each chairperson of the Historic Preservation Commissions from Hopewell Borough, Pennington Borough, and Hopewell Township. Each chair will give an introduction to their respective commissions. The in-person activity will be outdoors, appropriately socially distanced, with attendees being required to wear masks, and hand sanitizer will be available, and attendees will be asked to register ahead of time with their preference. So I hope to see many of you there. And thanks again, Kim and Nancy. I'm really looking forward to your program.
Thank you, Bob. So before we start the program, I'd like to just let everyone know that if you have any questions or comments during the program, feel free to type them in the chat window. I will be relaying them to Nancy during a Q&A session at the end of the program. So feel free to type away, and we will have a Q&A session at the end of the program. Now, a little bit about Nancy. Nancy Kennedy is a journalist and the author of 7 previous books. She was born in Rochester, New York, the home of Susan B. Anthony. But Nancy has been a Jersey girl since graduating from Penn State with a degree in journalism. For many years, she freelanced for magazines and newspapers, including the online Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. Now, early in her career, she worked at the Daily Paper in New Jersey, and later for the Dow Jones, editing the Wall Street Journal and Barron's for online readers. She lives in Hopewell with her husband, John, and their son, Evan, when he comes home from college on breaks. So welcome, Nancy. I can't wait to see Nancy's outfit. I think Nancy will be appropriately attired. Hi, Nancy. Thank you for joining us.
I did come dressed for the occasion.
Yes, looking beautiful.
It's hot. I don't know why the suffragists didn't, why the amendment wasn't ratified in November and not August.
Well, you're a trooper. You're a trooper. I was told that, and also we tried Nancy's air unit, but it was a little bit loud when we were rehearsing this. So we decided that Nancy would go.
I just have to suffer for the cause. That's all.
Yes. You wanted to share with us a PowerPoint.
Yes, I do have some slides to go along with my talk. Shall I start them up now?
Sure. I love your background as well.
No, I think it's generic.
You can close this window, Nancy. Yes.
Yeah, there we go. Okay. Are we all set?
Looks great.
All right. Well, I'm happy. Well, thank you first to the library and the Historical Society and the museum for hosting me tonight. I'm so glad you asked me to present a program tonight because today, August 18th, 2020, is the exact date of the 100th anniversary of women winning the vote through the ratification of the 19th Amendment. I've been privileged to be a part of the celebration because I wrote a book called Women Win the Vote, 19 for the 19th Amendment. It was published by Norton Young Readers this year. And Kim, when you asked me to do this talk, it was quite a challenge because you asked me to talk about just 3 women when I had to choose 19 women for my book, and that was hard enough. But I've managed to choose just 3 women to talk about tonight, one for each generation of women that fought for the vote. We're titling it The Suffrage Fight in 3 Acts. Before I talk about the women, I think we maybe will just set some background for the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment was first introduced to Congress in 1878 as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. It was then to be the 16th Amendment. And the wording is exactly the wording that was passed in 1920, and this is the wording: "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." And then secondly, Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So that's it, 40 words. So why did it take so long for this simple concept, votes for women, to become law? To answer that question, I think we need to talk a little bit about how women were viewed and treated in the 17 and 1800s. In 1776, at the founding of our country, Abigail Adams wrote to her husband, John Adams, who of course later became our second president. They were establishing the laws for our new country at the Second Continental Congress. And Abigail wrote to him and said, admonished him to remember the ladies. "Remember the ladies," she said. "If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." So why was Abigail so sure that the ladies would be forgotten? Well, at that time, women were essentially second-class citizens. Not only could they not vote, they couldn't testify in court, they couldn't serve on a jury, they couldn't sign a contract. They were rarely educated, and if they were, it was only perhaps to a grade school level. Certainly not college. Colleges were closed to women. A woman rarely worked for wages, and if she did, she had to hand over her paycheck to her husband or to whoever the male head of the household was, father, brother, even son. If she married, a woman's identity essentially was dissolved into her husband. Anything she brought into the marriage, property and inheritance, it became his. Anything she had, clothing, jewelry, furniture, it was all his. In a divorce, and only a male could divorce, in a divorce, the husband got custody of the children. The mother had no say in their upbringing or their future. And this one really surprised me. If a woman married someone who was not an American citizen, her American citizenship was taken away. And of course, enslaved women had absolutely no rights at all. Now, there was an exception to the rule, and because I believe there's probably a large audience of New Jersey residents here tonight, I just want to say that in New Jersey, we actually had the right to vote. When our state constitution was drawn up in 1776, there was no exclusionary language. Women and African Americans could vote. There was a property requirement of 50 British pounds, so married women couldn't vote, but single women and widowed women could. In 1800, in fact, when Thomas Jefferson was elected president, some newspapers said some pretty favorable things. The newspaper in Newton, New Jersey, where I once worked, said this: "May their patriotic conduct add an irresistible zest to their charms." Not everyone shared that view, however. Another man, an attorney, wrote into a paper and said, "Nothing can be a greater mockery of the sacred right than to suffer it to be executed by persons who do not even pretend to any judgment on the subject." Well, apparently he spoke for a lot of men, because the right to vote was taken away in 1807. There was a hotly contested election in Elizabeth, New Jersey, and men were unhappy with the outcome. They accused women and African Americans of voter fraud. And even though that was not true, when they later amended the state constitution, women and African Americans were disenfranchised, leaving only white men to vote in the state. So here in New Jersey, we were working to get back a right that we had once had. In the early 1800s, women started to speak out individually for women's rights and for the vote. In the 1810s and 20s, a woman named Fanny Wright started to speak about the condition of women. And it was shocking because, number one, no one talked about women's rights at the time. And number two, she was speaking publicly from pulpits and from town meeting halls. She was ridiculed, as you can see in this cartoon. She was called a downright gabbler, or a goose that deserves to be hissed. And she certainly was hissed. In the next couple of decades, a woman named Margaret Fuller joined her voice to the cause. She wrote a book in 1845 called The Woman in the 19th Century. And suffragists later credited Margaret with the ideas that underpin the American women's rights movement. Even some men began to speak out. Samuel May, a Unitarian minister, wrote a very famous sermon called The Rights and Condition of Women. In it, he said, "Why should one half of the people have the right to govern the whole?" You can see this whole sermon just by Googling it. It's also in the Library of Congress because it ultimately became a suffrage tract. An interesting thing about Samuel May is that he is an uncle to Louisa May Alcott, who of course is the author of Little Women. But the Women's Rights Convention of 1848 is widely considered the start of the public fight for the women's vote here in the United States. So that's where we'll start tonight. It was a 72-year fight that went on through 18 presidents, 2 wars, and 3 generations of women. So I've chosen one woman from each generation to represent that generation. The 3 women I'll be talking about tonight are Lucretia Mott, Ida B. Wells-Barnett, and the Jersey girl, Alice Paul. So let's start with Lucretia Mott. And I would just like to say that these colored and illustrated pages come from my book, and I want to give a shout out to my wonderful illustrator, Katie Dockrell. Lucretia was born in 1793, and she grew up on the island of Nantucket. Her father was a ship captain, and her mother ran a general store on the island. Lucretia was used to being in charge. When her mother would go to the mainland to get supplies for the store, she would be in charge of the store and take care of her 3 siblings. Now, Quakers were unusual for the time. They believed in the equality of men and women. And so they often educated their girls when other families would not. Lucretia had a good education. She was sent here to this boarding school, the 9 Partners Friends boarding school. I couldn't find a photo of the building. It may not exist, but this is a lovely drawing from another student, Julia Wilbur. It was also fun to note that another student at the school, Daniel Anthony, the father of Susan B. Anthony, went to the school at the same time that Lucretia did. Lucretia graduated in 1810 and she took a teaching position at the school. It was then when her sense of injustice was awakened. She discovered that as a female teacher, she was being paid less than the male teachers. And at the time, she said to herself, I resolved for myself to claim all that an impartial creator had bestowed. Well, Lucretia's causes started with abolition, the end of slavery. She married another teacher at the school and they moved to Pennsylvania, lived outside of Philadelphia. In 1833, she started the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. And a couple years later, she helped to found the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. Here is the leadership of that society. There's Lucretia there seated second from the right. And you can see that the leadership is almost equally made up of men and women. Lucretia's causes were, her ideas were considered radical even for the time and even for Quakers. She believed not only in the end of slavery, but also full civil rights for African Americans. She was a generous woman who donated to many causes, and one of these causes was this newspaper, the Provincial Freeman. The Provincial Freeman was started by Mary Ann Shadd Cary, who you can see there on the left. In founding the paper, Mary Ann became the first African American woman to found a newspaper in North America. And just a side note, Mary Ann is another suffragist I included in my book. Kim, I'm trying to fit in as many as I can. In 1840, Lucretia went with her husband to the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London. Apparently, the organizers of the convention were shocked that the Americans had brought female delegates to the convention, and they immediately began discussing whether the women could participate. The discussion went on for 3 entire days, and at the end of those 3 days, the men decided that no, the women could not participate. They couldn't sit on the convention floor. They had to sit at the side behind a curtain rail. They couldn't speak, they couldn't vote, they couldn't participate in any way. Well, of course, the women were angry about this, and they made their feelings known in a number of ways. There's a couple of sentences in a book called The History of Women's Suffrage, where the women report that they went back to their hotel, they started a fire in the central hearth of the hotel, and they kept it burning day and night from then on. And it was the middle of June, so I imagine it was quite hot in there. And they report that men started to flee the hotel looking for more amenable accommodation. Well, on this trip, Lucretia met Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Elizabeth was a young woman on her honeymoon. She and Lucretia struck up a strong friendship during this time. And they agreed at some time back in the States that they would get together again and discuss the oppression of women and how they wanted to see it addressed. Well, the two women were raising families, so a number of years passed. But in 1848, they met again at a mutual friend's house in Seneca Falls, New York. 5 women met for tea that afternoon. They discussed the oppression of women and how they wanted to see things change. They decided the thing to do would be to hold a convention in just 6 days' time. To prepare for the convention, they wrote up a document called the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions. In this document, they addressed the ways women were treated inequitably, and also the resolutions that they wanted to see to address these inequities. So 6 days later, they opened the doors here at the Wesleyan Methodist Chapel in Seneca Falls. 300 people showed up for the convention, and the women were surprised that men arrived and they wanted to come into the convention. Well, they had a brief confab and decided that they would not treat men the way that they had been treated in London, and they let the men come into the convention. At the convention, they discussed the Declaration, and eventually over the 2 days, July 19th and 20th, they voted on the resolutions. 10 of the resolutions passed unanimously. One of the resolutions created a heated debate, and that resolution was the woman's vote. Some women thought that it was such a radical idea that it would make them look ridiculous, or it would sink the other things that they wanted, like access to education and marriage rights. Even Lucretia thought that it was too radical an idea to press at this time. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton held firm. She pressed her case, and eventually the resolution was voted on and it passed. Lucretia immediately came over to Elizabeth's side, and for the rest of her life, she worked for the women's vote. She would often say, the question is often asked, what does a woman want more than she enjoys? I answer, she asks nothing as favor, but as right. She wants to be acknowledged a moral, responsible being. She is seeking not to be governed by laws in the making of which she has had no voice. Well, you can visit the Women's Rights National Park today, well, when the national parks open again. This is a grouping of statues in the Visitors Center. You can see a familiar face over there on the left, Frederick Douglass. He attended the convention, and he was the only man to speak at the convention. He was a great friend of the women's cause for the rest of his life. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's house is also open, as well as the Wesleyan Methodist Chapel. One more thing about Lucretia before we leave her. In 1864, Lucretia helped found Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania, along with William Perry, who was the grandfather of Alice Paul. Lucretia was involved because she wanted to make sure that women could get an education, that they could finally go to college, and her wish was granted. So for the rest of her life, Lucretia spoke out for the vote. Although Quakers were committed to peaceful, nonviolent ways, Lucretia never shrank from the fight for women's rights. To her, Quakerism does not mean quietism. She died in 1880, and still the vote was 40 years away. So a second generation of women sprung up to carry on the fight. And from this second generation, we'll be talking about Ida B. Wells-Barnett. Now, Ida's been in the news this year. She was awarded a posthumous Pulitzer Prize for her reporting on the lynching of African Americans. Ida was born in Holly Springs, Mississippi in 1862, but she was orphaned at the age of 16 when her parents and an infant brother died in the yellow fever epidemic that swept through the United States in the 1870s. You can see here at Hillcrest Cemetery in Holly Springs a memorial to the victims of the yellow fever. An interesting note here is that another suffragist in my book, Mary Church Terrell, was born into an African-American family in Memphis, Tennessee. Her father became quite wealthy by buying up property that was abandoned in the yellow fever epidemic. Well, to keep the family together, Ida took a teaching job. She moved to Memphis, Tennessee, where she had an aunt who could help take care of the children. Even so, her life was hard. She got a teaching job, convincing a school that she was 18 and not 16. but she had to commute 6 miles each way by donkey. And after 2 years, the aunt had a stroke and could no longer help care for the children. So once again, Ida was in charge of her small family. It was an act of racism that radicalized Ida. One day, she was taking a train trip to Nashville. She bought a ticket for the first class ladies' car. She gathered her things together and took her seat in the car. But in just a few moments, the conductor showed up at her elbow and told her that she would have to get up and move to the back of the train to the colored car. Well, Ida was having none of this, and she refused. At that, the conductor tried to drag her from her seat. Even then, Ida would not back down. She said, "The moment the conductor caught hold of my arm, I fastened my teeth in the back of his hand." Well, apparently the conductor called for help because a couple of passengers helped the conductor drag Ida from the train and deposit her on the platform. From then on, she began writing about the condition of African Americans in the United States for Black newspapers in Memphis. "The way to right wrongs," she said, "is to shine the light of truth upon them." She eventually took the editorship of a Black newspaper called the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight. For her activism and her journalism, she eventually lost her teaching job. But that was fine with her because she said, "It was through journalism that I found the real me." And I can relate to her in that statement. Well, Ida quickly zeroed in on the Jim Crow laws, and especially lynching of African Americans. 3 friends of hers were brutally murdered for defending their grocery store against a mob of white supremacists. She began writing not only for local papers, but also for national papers. You can see here that she wrote a series for the New York Age that was later bound into this book called Southern Horrors. Well, because of her journalism and her activism, her life was endangered. She began to be followed to and from work. And then one night, the office of the Memphis Free Speech was burned to the ground by a mob of white men. Friends of hers urged her to move north where she could live safely. Reluctantly, she did so. She moved first to New York and then to Chicago, where she lived for the rest of her life. In Chicago, Ida began working for the vote. Illinois had a thriving suffrage movement, and in fact, in 1913, Illinois granted women the right to vote in that state. It was a huge victory because it was the first state east of the Mississippi that had granted women the vote. Yet Ida saw that Black women were not becoming involved in local politics or in the fight for a national federal amendment to enfranchise all women. She founded the Alpha Suffrage Club. Here's a photo of that club. The Alpha Suffrage Club was the first Black women's suffrage organization in the United States. It eventually grew to over 200 members, and it was instrumental in electing the first Black alderman in Chicago's history. Well, Chicago was a big year. In Washington, D.C., there was a huge suffrage parade being organized. Here you can see the cover of the program for that parade. It was being organized by Alice Paul, who we'll talk about later on. She had planned it for this weekend, March 3rd, 1913. She knew that there would be huge crowds in town for President Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, and she wanted to draw them over to the suffrage parade. It's estimated that more than 8,000 men and women marched in this parade, rode horses, rode on floats, played in marching bands. It was the largest parade that Washington, D.C. had seen in its history. Well, the parade stepped off at 3:30 in the afternoon. And you can see here they're proceeding down Pennsylvania Avenue. The women have a lot of space. The crowd is well pushed back on the sidewalks. But within a few blocks, the crowd pressed in and turned violent. You can see, well, you can't really see the women here. The crowd has pressed in on them. Men had been drinking for days and they started to attack the women. They threw lighted cigarettes and cigars at them. They tripped them. They tried to pull them off of floats. They tore at their clothing and banners. They even beat them with the poles of the banners. Hundreds were injured and 100 women were hospitalized with their injuries. There was later a congressional investigation into the parade, and it was found that the police ignored the growing crowd and in fact encouraged them. One policeman was heard to say, "If you had only stayed at home, this never would have happened." Well, the parade is noted not only for its violence, but for a taint of racism. Alice Paul believed that if Black women marched, the issue of race would overshadow the issue of the vote. She knew that Southern men objected to widening the voting rolls to Black women because they thought that white supremacy would be jeopardized. She tried to ignore the issue. Black women's groups would write to her asking if they would be able to march, and she simply didn't answer. But of course, ignoring an issue doesn't make it go away. On the day of the march, Alice asked Black women to march at the back of the parade, not with their state delegation or their professional organization or their college club. Ida had come with 60 women from the Alpha Suffrage Club, and they were fully expecting to march under the Illinois banner. At the start of the parade, Ida's friends, Ida was nowhere to be found. Her friends thought that perhaps she was boycotting the parade because she was seen to be quite angry with Alice for her edict. But a few blocks into the parade, Ida jumped out from the crowd and joined the all-white delegation from Illinois. This is a photo from the Chicago Tribune. She later told the Tribune, "I'm not taking this stand because I personally wish for recognition. I'm doing it for the future benefit of my entire race." Well, so Ida's legacy is one of working both for racial and gender equality. And she was highly effective in what she did. When Illinois granted women the vote, national suffrage leader Carrie Chapman Catt said that suffrage sentiment doubled overnight. In Ida's view, all inequities would be addressed by the woman's vote. I think her quote is one of the most powerful ones in the book. "With no sacredness of the ballot, there can be no sacredness of human life itself." Ida did live to see women get the vote, and she continued as an activist and journalist for the rest of her life until she died in 1931. So meanwhile, this third generation of women sprang up to fight for the vote. And from this third generation, we'll be talking about the Jersey girl, Alice Paul. Alice was born in 1885. She had a sedate upbringing in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. She was an 8th generation Quaker who was sheltered from the outside world. She said, "I never met anybody who wasn't a Quaker, except for the maids we had were always Irish Catholic." Well, I love that statement. It's funny because Alice's name is forever linked with that of Lucy Burns, a suffragist who grew up in an Irish Catholic family in Brooklyn, New York. Alice and Lucy became the Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony of their generation. And Lucy is another suffragist who is in my book. You can visit Alice's childhood home in Mount Laurel, New Jersey today. The first floor has exhibits, and the second floor is a research library and an archive for researchers. Alice earned her college education at Swarthmore, thanks to Lucretia Mott and her grandfather, and she earned further degrees at the University of Pennsylvania. You can see that opportunities are beginning to open up for women now in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But it was Alice's time spent studying in England that brought her to the suffrage cause. There, she joined the militant branch of the British suffrage movement under the leadership of Emmeline Pankhurst. British suffragists picketed, they protested, they broke windows, they set fires, they put letter bombs in mailboxes. Alice was arrested for the first time at a protest in front of the Houses of Parliament, and she later met Lucy Burns at the police station. Alice returned to the United States in 1910. When she returned, she found that the national suffrage movement was flagging. National suffrage leaders were dedicated to earning the vote state by state. And to that end, they were lobbying and persuading and speaking and going on tours of the states. Alice at first joined that organization, but she grew frustrated with that approach. She didn't see it. She didn't see anything happening from it. By 1910, only 5 states had granted women the vote, and they were all in the West. Alice decided to start her own organization, the Congressional Union. She took up offices in Washington, D.C., and she began a campaign of defiant activities. In this photo, Alice is in her office. You can see that she's become quite a determined young woman. It's said that she refused to heat her room, which was up over her office here, so that she wouldn't be tempted to read late into the night. She was a great reader. She liked detective stories, and in particular the novels of Charles Dickens. Her group's organization, her activities started in 1913 when Lucy Burns chalked an advertisement on a sidewalk for a suffrage meeting, an act for which she was fined $1. Alice also started to organize parades at this time, like the one that we just mentioned before. In 1913, she also started a newspaper, The Suffragist. She wanted to have a place to air her opinions and her organization's activities. Here you can see 3 women with their copies of The Suffragist. On the right is Jeanette Rankin. Jeanette was the first woman elected to a congressional seat. She was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1916 from the state of Montana, where women had had the vote since 1914. Jeanette is also in my book. Well, Alice believed that Congress needed to pass a federal amendment enfranchising all women at the same time. She was annoyed by President Wilson, who was ignoring the issue. But I do need to stop here for the New Jersey audience and say that President Wilson did vote for women's suffrage. In 1915, he came here to New Jersey, to Princeton, to vote in a statewide referendum that would give women the vote. When he came here, he actually voted for women's suffrage, but he later said that he was voting as a private citizen and he was not going to force his opinion on Congress. Well, to drill down even farther, here in Mercer County voters defeated the referendum by a vote of about 7,000 voters for and more than 10,000 against. In Pennington, the vote was 59 for and 97 against. In Hopewell Borough, where I live, the vote was 62 for and 193 against. And in the wider Hopewell Township, it was 82 for and 225 against. It was tallies like these that sank the referendum. It went down in defeat. Well, time went by and Alice became even more aggravated by President Wilson. She decided to up the ante. She began picketing at the White House gates. Here you can see a picket line. I think they're from Pennsylvania. Suffragists were the first organized group to picket the White House. Alice had decided on peaceful civil disobedience. She did not want to get into the violence that the British suffragists were known for. She didn't feel that would get her what she wanted. So they called themselves the Silent Sentinels. They let their banners and sashes speak for themselves. For example, the banner here says, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" The first day of picketing was January 10th, 1917. And after the first day of picketing, Alice got a letter at her office. It read, "I wish to make a protest against the methods you are adopting in annoying the president. I hope thee will call it off." Well, the letter was from her mother, her quiet, peaceful Quaker mother. Well, Alice didn't listen to her mother and, of course, didn't stop her protesting. Here she is in one of my favorite photographs. She's heading out from her headquarters to picket at the White House. And her banner reads, "The time has come to conquer or submit. For us, there is but one choice. We have made it." Well, Alice's picketing went on peacefully for about 6 months. They gathered larger and larger crowds. Sometimes the crowds were supportive of the women, but sometimes the crowds got unruly. And eventually, in June, police started arresting the women. At times they were released immediately, but at other times they were fined. In court, the women refused to pay the fines. They refused even to give their names. So eventually the judge began sentencing them to jail. The terms could be as little as a day or as much as 6 or 7 months in the case of Alice and Lucy, who headed the picket line. The jails that they were sent to were inhospitable. One of them had been condemned a few years earlier. The treatment of the women was inhumane, even brutal. One night in November 1917 came to be known as the Night of Terror. That night, about 36 women were beaten and dragged by their hair and their arms down into basement cells at Occoquan Workhouse. One woman had a heart attack when she was thrown to the floor. One woman blacked out when she was thrown against an iron bench. Lucy Burns, her arms were chained to the bars of her cell door, where she was kept all night long, as she was known as the leader of the pickets that day. Well, Alice wasn't at all concerned that the women, that they were being imprisoned. In fact, she welcomed it. She had been imprisoned in Britain, and so she was familiar with it. In prison, she wanted to have the women's status changed from criminal to political prisoner. If they could be called political prisoners, they could take the suffrage cause to the courts and sidestep Congress. Well, the prison wardens weren't interested in calling them political prisoners, and so Alice decided to up the ante. She decided to start hunger strikes. She was also familiar with hunger striking, as she had done that in England as well. Well, the jail wardens still didn't give the women what they wanted. They did not want to release the women. They wanted them to serve their terms out, but they also didn't want the women to die in prison and so that the suffrage cause would have martyrs to rally around. They eventually decided on force feeding the women. Of course, there are no photographs of force feeding, but this is a pretty accurate description of it. The women's arms and legs were held down or tied down to chairs. Their head was yanked back and held in place. And a prison doctor would force a rigid feeding tube down their nose or throat, and into which he would pour a mixture of eggs and milk. Well, it was such a brutal procedure, and it was so terrifying and so painful for the women that it really had no effect at all, because afterwards the women would just vomit everything back up again. And so they continued to weaken. A journalist at the time, Juna Barnes, underwent the force feeding procedure voluntarily, and she later said the agony of it was indescribable. One of Alice's prison mates smuggled a note out of the prison, and in it she said, "Don't let them tell you that we take it well. Miss Paul vomits much. It is horrible." Well, when the women became too weak, the prison wardens had no choice but to release them. And here you can see in this newspaper photo a hunger striker being released. You can see that she's so weak that she can't stand or walk. It's photos like these and articles that the American public began to read avidly, and in time, public sentiment swung in favor of the suffragists. Alice protests went on from 1917 to 1919. Wilson finally gave his support in 1918. And in 1919, in June 1919, Congress passed the 19th Amendment. Of course, then I had to go out to the states to be ratified, and it required 3/4 of the states of the time to vote yes on the amendment. And at the time, that was 36 states. And so on this day, August 18th, 1920, the 36th state, Tennessee, ratified the amendment, and women won the right to vote. Here you can see Alice Paul unfurling a victory flag at her headquarters in Washington. It was purple, gold, and white, and there were 36 stars on it. She had sewed the stars on herself, one for each state that had ratified the amendment. After 1920 and women won the vote, Alice's activities are lesser known. Her congressional union morphed into the National Women's Party. You can see that written over the door here. And in 1923, she authored the Equal Rights Amendment. She called it the Lucretia Mott Amendment. That amendment, Alice worked for it for the rest of her life. It made it through Congress 50 years later, before Alice died in 1977. And then, of course, the ratification process began for that amendment. Here, you can see a cartoon of talking about the ratification date of the ERA. You can see that the artist has harkened back to the suffrage era, with his main character chained to the gates of what looked like the White House gates. I have to say that in all my research, I didn't see anything that said that suffragists chained themselves to the gates, but nevertheless, it's an image that people resonated to. Well, the amendment failed to be ratified by the time of the deadline in 1982, but it is currently in the news, and its future is being debated again. So Alice devoted her life to the vote and to women's equality. She certainly lived that opening quote of hers that we saw: "It is worth sacrificing everything for: leisure, money, reputation, even our lives." So that's the three women I wanted to talk about tonight, but I also had a couple of photographs for the benefit of the New Jersey audience. I thought I'd show you a few things about the suffrage fight around the state of New Jersey. Suffragists had symbolic objects that they created and took around with them because they knew it would draw crowds to their events. Here you can see a suffrage liberty torch in the middle there. It was patterned on the torch that the Statue of Liberty holds. It made its way around New Jersey several times. Alice Paul had a benefactor, Louisine Havemeyer. She was called the Sugar King's wife. She was married to the sugar refiner who started the company that we know today as Domino Sugar. In 1915, Louisine was tasked with handing off this torch to the New Jersey suffragists to take around for the campaign for the referendum to giving women the vote. So she set off from Manhattan in a tugboat down the Hudson River carrying this torch. When she got to the meeting point, the New Jersey suffragists were not there. They had forgotten to get a permit to take out a boat, and they were off trying to get their permit. Meanwhile, the weather kicked up and Louisine became seasick, and she laid down in the boat waiting for the New Jersey boat. And she later said, "I closed my eyes and tried to think of my speech and of our great cause, but it was no use. I became more wretched with every moment. I was about ready to commit myself to the waves when I heard a cheery voice say, 'New Jersey is here.'" The New Jersey suffragists had gotten their permit. The torch, Louisine gave her speech, handed off the torch, and here they are arriving back at the dock in Jersey City. Suffragists also had a suffrage justice bell. You can see that it's on the Liberty Bell. One difference is that the clapper of the bell was chained to the inside of the bell to indicate that women's voices were being silenced. The torch, the suffrage torch, has been lost to history, but you can see this bell at Valley Forge National Park in Pennsylvania. It's in the visitor center. Again, something you'll be able to see once the parks reopen. I also got to thinking about the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. The suffragists were scheduled to come to the state to run a campaign against an anti-suffrage candidate in South Jersey, Senator David Baird. You can see here that a makeshift hospital has been set up to treat the victims of the flu. By the time the suffragists were supposed to arrive, 4,500 people in New Jersey had already died, but they came anyway, and a suffragist later reported on the scene saying that siphoned off by the war, that is, of course, World War I, doctors and nurses were scarce, hospitals were overrun, dead bodies piled up so fast that teams of horses plowed mass graves. Well, despite this grim scene, the suffragists stayed. They were under the leadership of Alice Paul's sister, Helen. They ran their campaign, and unfortunately, it failed, and Senator Baird was reelected. But of course, women eventually did win the vote, and New Jersey ratified the 19th Amendment on February 9th, 1920. It became the 29th state to ratify the amendment. Well, regardless of anyone's opinion about the women's vote before 1920, it didn't take long for politicians to realize that the pool of potential voters had just doubled overnight. Soon enough, candidates for elective office were appealing to women as voters. I found this ad in the local paper, the Hopewell Herald, from 1923. Dr. Clinton H. Reed is running for Mercer County Sheriff. In his ad here, he says, he voted for all bills tending to uplift the moral standing of the state, and that includes women's suffrage. Well, I looked it up. Clinton Reed lost the election to his competitor, Charles Reichert. But it's interesting to note that when Mr. Reichert took office as the sheriff, he appointed as his undersheriff a woman, an attorney from Trenton, New Jersey, Rose Perlman. And in that appointment, Rose became the first woman to take that office in New Jersey. So that's the end of the talk. Before I hand it over to you, Kim, I just wanted to say that in addition to my book, my publisher commissioned a teacher's guide, and it's become quite valuable now that so many students are being taught at home. It's available as a free download from my website, and my website is simply my name, nancybkennedy.com. Thank you. That's it, Kim. I'm ready for questions.
Thank you so much, Nancy. That was wonderful. I learned so much, even beyond your book. I feel that you put so much effort into it, so I really appreciate it. We have a participant who just wanted to comment on just the wonderful photos that you put together.
Oh, the Library of Congress is such a fantastic site. You can lose yourself for hours just looking through, Googling, typing in keywords and coming up with these wonderful photos.
Wow, that's good to know. It's good to know. Yeah, Michelle, one of our participants, just commented on the wonderful photos. She said she hadn't seen many of them, and she really enjoyed the connections that were pointed out among the suffragists, familial or otherwise, and she wanted to thank you.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I really enjoyed about writing the book, was to show how these women knew each other. They, one generation became mentors for the next generation, taught them how to do very practical things like raise funds or speak. It was difficult to speak at the time. There were no microphones. They had to shout above crowds that were throwing things at them. Rocks, rotten fruit, rum bottles. Women needed to support each other to get through this.
Yes, I mean, in reading your book, I just learned so much, because here is just a sampling of 3 of these extraordinary women. In your book, you feature 19 of them. And you mentioned it was hard to single them out. Are there any others you would like to mention that were your favorites from your book?
Yes, I loved Frances Willard. She was a suffragist and the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. So you think maybe she sounds like something of a buzzkill, but I loved her. Her memoir, 50 Years and More, she was so relatable. She talked about how she hated the clothing of the time, how when she turned 16 and had to don the clothing of a woman, she considered that her martyrdom. In her 50s, she learned to ride a bicycle and wrote a best-selling book about it. And one of the things that I just love that she said one of the greatest regrets of her life is that she would never be published in Atlantic Monthly. And as a writer, I can relate to that because I'm sure I'm going to share that regret as well.
Oh, it's interesting because we are so in debt to so many of these suffragists. I have another question, actually. I've noticed that there's 2 different terminologies, the suffragettes, the suffragists. Could you distinguish them? Are they different?
They are different. And I made sure to use the correct word, which in the United States was the suffragist. In Britain, the women were given the name of suffragette, and it was sort of a derisive term, kind of belittling what they were doing. But the British suffragists were not deterred. They just accepted that as their word, and they called themselves suffragettes.
Okay, well, thank you for clarifying, because I was uncertain about that. So I'm learning something new all the time.
I keep researching the suffragists, and I keep learning, and it's just amazing to me that I didn't learn any of this in school, even growing up in Rochester, New York. Yeah, it's just fun for me to learn all this.
I felt the same way, Nancy, when I read your book. I thought, wow, this is such a gem for youth, for even anyone who, because I didn't learn this in school, certainly.
I know. The book is intended, of course, it was published by Norton Young Readers and intended for young people aged 9 to 13, but I'm finding that it's a perfectly good read for adults because very few of us learned anything. So it's a good introduction to the suffrage fight.
Yes, yes. Janet wanted to ask you, what do you think about Susan B. Anthony being pardoned today?
I knew that would come up. Susan B. Anthony didn't care a whit about anything but the vote. She was happy when she created quite a stir being arrested for voting in 1872. When at her 80th birthday, she was given a huge birthday party, and politicians and everybody said wonderful things about her. And she basically said, "I don't care what you think about me. I just want the vote." So her concern was always political. She wouldn't have cared one way or the other whether she was pardoned. In fact, when they were carting her off for having voted illegally, she was pretty pleased that they had to get on a trolley in order to get to the police station. And she was pretty pleased that everybody could see her on the trolley with the policeman being hauled off.
Oh my. Laurie has a question. Was it clear that African American women were not included when the 19th was ratified?
They were included. However, in the South, African American women and men were both prevented from voting through laws, literacy tests, and poll taxes, even violence and threats of violence. And so it wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that discrimination was ended entirely.
Okay.
And there were many groups of women who were not enfranchised in 1920, and I wrote them down so I wouldn't get the dates wrong. Native Americans didn't become citizens until 1924, and Chinese Americans until 1943. People of Asian Indian ancestry didn't become citizens until 1946, and Japanese Americans in 1951. Even DC residents could not vote until 1961. So it was not until 1965 that all discrimination ended. And in fact, in 1971, the voting age was dropped from 21 to 18. So a lot of changes happened over the years.
Yeah. Also things I don't recall learning in school. And I'm learning new things all the time. Victoria wants to know, besides the Library of Congress, where else did you go for your research?
I had a great year. I read about 75 books. I read hundreds of newspapers, articles, and magazine articles. I subscribed to 2 newspaper archives, and they are wonderful. You can look up thousands of old newspapers. There are also, well, everything's closed now, but so many institutions have research libraries. Harvard, for example, Radcliffe has a lot of things available online.
Sounds like a treasure trove.
Oh, I know, those newspaper archives, I would just get so involved in everything, every little article. It was amazing what people wrote about back then.
Wow. It's really great because you distilled everything down in your book in a way that's easy to read and also very powerful at the same time from all your research. So.
Oh, that was so much fun. I have to say that I learned how to tell a good story by focusing on the people. I mean, the suffrage fight was long, 72 years. And so you could get lost in the twists and turns. But if you focus on the people, you can really make it come to life.
Yes. I mean, I think that was what was most striking to me, was just the length of the time frame was so long and the fight was so long.
There's an easy way to remember it. From our founding of our country, 1776 to 1848 is 72 years. And then from 1848 to 1920 is 72 years. So women did not have the vote for 144 years.
Wow. Richard Ryan wanted to let you know, powerful presentation, thank you. What accounts for the expanded opportunities for women at the end of the 1800s? Being able to go to England, perhaps?
Hi, Rich. Rich was my very first editor, and I learned to tell a really good story through Rich. He would edit my articles and cross out the first 9 paragraphs and then just in the 10th paragraph.
Oh, yes, the editing.
What accounts for opportunities? Just growing women, they crisscross the country, speaking in public. Unbelievable. Some women spoke 400, 500 times a year. They were just making such a public, they were making it so public that it didn't make any sense any longer to deny them education. Gradually, things like for example, Isabella Beecher Hooker, who lived in Connecticut, she advocated for years for women in her state married women to be able to own property. And it took her, I think it was maybe 8 years, but she finally got that law passed so that women in Connecticut didn't have to pass their property on to their husbands. So it was like the little battles in every state that led to the open opportunities. Education. Oberlin was the first college that would admit both men and women. I think it was 1838. And from then on, didn't happen quickly, but from then on, other colleges joined, as we discussed, Swarthmore as well.
Yeah, it's very inspiring because it shows just the persistence and the little wins leading to more wins.
I know, it's the persistence that really sticks with me. They were passionate, but they were also persistent. They devoted their entire life to it. It's not something they did on the weekends, they had families that they were raising. It was an incredible effort on their part.
Yeah. Meg wants to know, did they eventually sign the 19th Amendment, or once they reached a 3/4 approval, was approval off the table?
Even after, this is a really interesting question because even after Tennessee ratified the amendment, meaning that women got the vote, immediately anti-suffragists started to protest, and they wanted the governor to vacate the ruling. And so they took it to the courts in Tennessee. So there was this fight first in Tennessee, and eventually it went to the Tennessee Supreme Court, and that took 2 years actually. So the women had won, but they were still trying to overturn that so that the 19th Amendment would not be approved. Wow. Although there were some states in the wings that would have jumped in, I believe, Vermont perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now Claudia wrote about Tennessee. Let's see if I can find. I have a lot of people commenting. Yes, so Claudia did write, I believe Tennessee was the last to ratify. Wasn't the story that a deciding vote was made by a man who was against it, but received a letter from his mother telling him to ratify it?
It's a fabulous story. Harry T. Byrne was, they thought he came from a conservative district, and they thought he would vote with the anti-suffragists. Indeed, he was wearing the red rose that the anti-suffragists were wearing, as opposed to the yellow that the suffragists were wearing. But that morning, Harry was young. He was like 24. He was the youngest man elected to the Tennessee General Assembly. He got a letter from his mother, who happened to be a college-educated woman, and she urged her son to be a good boy and vote for ratification. And he later said, it's always best for a boy to obey his mother. He voted surprisingly in favor, which turned the vote in favor of the suffragists.
Good for him.
And I'll just put in a note for Elaine Weiss, an author, has written a book called The Woman's Hour. It's all about the Tennessee fight, and what a fight it was, and you should read that book.
All right. Great recommendation. I am always looking for a good read. And a lot of different comments. Bev and Jeff wrote, in Rochester, New York, there will be a suffragist city parade on Saturday, September 12th, ending at the Susan B. Anthony Square Park.
Oh, I would love to go. I'm scheduled to speak that weekend in Seneca Falls. Otherwise, I would go up there because I have family up in Rochester still. My dad, I think, is watching tonight.
Ah.
And I would love to see him. But there's a great statue of Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass in Rochester. It's a tableau. They're sitting and having tea in park benches. And it's outside the Susan B. Anthony home that's now a museum. I was afraid that statue was going to get destroyed.
Oh.
But I don't think so.
And, I just want you to know, Richard Ryan just commented that it's not true about the first 9 graphs. So
we have to meet over coffee and we'll discuss it.
H.A. Hallett wants to know, why do you think so many school curriculums don't cover the suffragette movement as much as other historical periods?
Oh, this is my niece. I don't know what schools are currently teaching.
Yeah.
My recollection of history books was that they talked about wars and presidents. I just don't remember women's voices being included to any great extent.
Likewise, sadly, I don't remember. I remember that there just never seemed to be it seemed to be a lot on the colonial time period. And then as history moved forward, it seemed that we ran out of time to cover everything.
I think maybe civil rights are more on the table now today since the 1960s. And of course, this was really a huge civil rights movement, the suffrage movement. It was the largest one in the United States history to enfranchise an entire half of the population.
Yeah. Another comment, wonderful talk from Sandy. You've answered all my questions, says Sandy, except one. If given a time machine to go back and visit a woman, who would you choose?
I might go back to, in the early years of the suffrage fight, it wasn't segregated. Black and white women worked together. And Abby Kelly Foster in the mid-1800s was a mentor. So many women mentioned that she was a mentor and that she was a powerful speaker. And I would love to meet her. She seems, one newspaper account, she debated a newspaper editor, and he said that she swept away his arguments like chaff in the wind. And I'd love to meet a woman. I mean, women did not speak in public, and so where did they get this courage to speak? That's who I'd go back and talk to.
Oh, that's wonderful. Very inspiring. Now, Tara, the other librarian, wanted to remind me to ask you about the story behind your suffrage outfit. There's a story behind what you're wearing tonight.
Well, not much of a story to talk about. It's just, this is just what I had in my head when I've had so much fun writing a book for middle grade because you can take on the persona, and this is what's in everybody's mind. Although the women, as I look back in the old photos, the women were actually dressed all in white for the parades. And it fascinated me that I wondered where they got all these white outfits. And I read somewhere that department stores like Macy's would make the dresses, or the women would make their own. And I thought about having a white dress made, but I thought there was no way I could keep a white dress white throughout the year. So I have a white blouse and a black skirt, which was more indicative. In the 1910s. The suffrage movement widened out. It wasn't the province of wealthy women anymore. Working women joined the suffrage movement, and they were more likely to dress simply like this. They got rid of the corsets and the petticoats, and they had even bigger hats than this. And so it was the working women that could actually, as they started parading, they had to have more comfortable clothing. And so things got pared down. Even hemlines started to come up a little bit, at least for the younger generation.
Wow. Wow. And also, I've noticed your background. You have a cat back there. Is there a story behind the cat? Is that an original, like, is that a copy of an original?
That's a poster from the British women's fight for the vote, as is the tea towel on the other side of me. Cats, the same as today, 100 years ago, women knew that cats would draw attention. And so this cat poster was a symbol of the British fight for the vote. I think it says votes for women on it. And also, we brought that over in the United States. In 1916, two suffragists went on a trip around the country, a 10,000-mile loop around the country, Alice Burke and Nell Richardson. They were driving a Saxon Roadster, which was outrageous for 1916. And they started out from New York City. And as they started to drive off, somebody dumped a black kitten in the car. And so they took this kitten with them. They called it Saxon. And the kitten was a huge draw when they stopped and had meetings. And they took it with them for the entire 5-month trip. And for the New Jersey folks, when Nell and Alice took off from New York City, their first stop was Trenton, New Jersey.
Wow. I really appreciate all the New Jersey. I'm sure everyone's really appreciating all the New Jersey information too.
I wonder if someone in every state has looked into their state suffrage movement. There's so much there.
Yeah. Well, also, Nancy, you are going to be at an event on August 26th. Is that correct? And an event, a socially distanced book signing in Hopewell at the gazebo. And can you tell me a little bit more about that, and our audience a little bit more about that event?
Right.
Questions for you? They want to see you.
It's August 26th, which was a Wednesday, from 4 to 6 at Gazebo Park. You know that it's at the intersection of Columbia and Greenwood, next to the post office. I'm going to be there, as well as the Hopewell Valley League of Women Voters. They'll be signing up voters, and I'll have my book available. I'm also going to have, if you're interested in more of this New Jersey history, I will have some posters with more photographs of the suffrage fight in New Jersey.
Wow. And I can speak for myself reading your book. I just thought that it was so informative, and that, again, your illustrator is marvelous. Very colorful book. And the library, the Pennington Public Library, will be selling copies of your book. I'm going to send out a link at the end of this program. Actually, maybe I can paste the link into the chat for everyone. This is an order form for Nancy's book, and there's more information in the order form about the cost of the book, and you could even write, if you want it inscribed, you can write who you want to get it inscribed to in this form. And if you fill this out by September 1st and get us a check by September 1st to the library, then you can pick up a copy of Nancy's book signed from our library. We can schedule a pickup for you, because we're doing curbside pickup nowadays anyway.
And I also, let me just add that I'll be, 10% of the sales will go to the Pennington Library, because I appreciate everything that you're doing for me.
Yes, thank you so much, Nancy. And I can't recommend this book highly enough. I really enjoyed it.
And also, I'll throw in a Votes for Women pin. when you.
Oh, that's
open the book.
right.
Yeah.
It looks like a neat pin. Nancy did send me a image earlier. You sent me an image of it. And
It's based on the historic Votes for Women pin.
Oh, wow. Okay, so free pin, signed book. And also, before we go, I don't know if anyone else has any other further questions. Just feel free to chat them in the window. I'll try to get to them, to Nancy. But before we go, I just wanted everyone to know if you have any further comments, feedback. We do usually send out a survey link at the end of our program, so feel free to fill out the survey. We do read through them and take into consideration what you'd like for our next Zoom programs. And then also, just briefly, in September, this upcoming fall, we have a lot of great programs slated. We have another documentary film series that we have slated, and we're doing an art series right now with Janet Mandel. She spoke about Klimt last week for us, and then before that she spoke about Renoir. We're having her come back to speak about another artist in September. If you go to penningtonlibrary.org, you can read about all of our upcoming programs and also register for them online. And I think that is it for me. Nancy, anything else? Bob, also anything else?
I'm good. I really appreciate your hosting me tonight.
I really appreciate you imparting your wisdom to us, and with your lovely background, and I've been really excited about this talk for a while, and so thank you for telling us all about this really, really important movement and these really important women. And a lot of comments about how wonderful the program has been. And so with that, I'm going to bid everyone a wonderful good night. And again, Nancy's available at Gazebo Park on August 26th from 4 to 6 p.m. If you have any further questions, you can email me at kha@penningtonlibrary.org. Good evening, everyone, and thank you again to Nancy, the Hopewell Museum, Hopewell Valley Historical Society, and all of you for joining us. Good night.
Good night.